Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to make fluffy cheek fur for your plushies just like this. So what I did was make a test plush, and I did that mainly because my character has a lot of applique going on that is very difficult to pattern within the paper pattern itself. And since I was doing that, I went ahead and laid on the faux fur since I had a test plush anyway. Typically when I pattern cheek fluff, I don't need to do a test plush because it's generally a very simple shape, how the cheek fluff lies, and you can just pattern this directly onto your piece of paper. But since I was doing a test plush anyway, I just pinned on the faux fur how I wanted it to land and then traced that shape onto my test plush. So this is actually a scanned image of the minky piece that is my test plush head. You can see this is actually minky with the stitch marks here, even though I'm running out of ink, so it's a little bit difficult to see. But this blue line was where I traced with a fabric pen where I want my cheek fur to be. Now, this character has very fluffy cheek fur. So you can see just how nice and thick this faux fur is. And I purposely patterned it thick, and you can totally control for how thick you want this fur to be. So if you didn't want it to be so thick, you need to think of a couple things. One is how long is the pile of your faux fur. My faux fur has a pretty long pile. I think it's 2 to 3 inches. So I have that working with me to get a nice fluffy effect. So I also pattern it to be kind of thick here, where it comes out almost a couple inches at its widest part to get a nice thick cheek fur. But you can definitely slim this down if you don't want such a thick cheek fur. So to pattern that out, again, I have my seam allowance line, and then what you're going to do is cut out along the seam allowance line and then add seam allowance to the line where you cut. So I'm just going to cut along the pattern. And my pattern pieces always have seam allowance on them. If you don't tend to include seam allowance on your patterns, that's fine too. It's just whatever you prefer and whatever you're used to. So now I'm just going to cut along this line, which I've designated to be the seam line. So if your patterns don't include seam allowance, then you're pretty much done. You can go ahead and cut this piece out of minky, and you can cut this piece out of faux fur. But since I add seam allowance, I just need to add seam allowance only to the area where I've cut the seam. So I'm just gonna trace my fur piece. And then this is the side where I cut, so I would just need to add seam allowance. And I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just gonna eyeball it. Okay? So from here, then you have to decide which way you want your faux fur to run. For me, I run it out to the side, which I think is going to make sense in most cases, that you would want it sticking out like this. But I suppose you could have a character where it makes more sense to run it down or maybe even up. So it just helps to mark which direction you want your faux fur to run. So I just put a line marking that it's going to run out to the left. So then from here I would do the same process where I would trace this head piece and add my seam allowance just around this cut line right here. So then you're going to end up with two pieces. One's going to be your faux fur, which I have here, and I've done extra steps because my character has a couple color transitions. I just did some more color blocking within my pattern piece. So you can see here how I've separated out all the color transitions and drawn lines. I've marked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 just to help me keep an order of which way the pieces go. So when you have a lot of small pieces, helps to number them in some way. And then marking white versus red. So from there you would just cut where you want your seam to be and then add seam allowance along your cut lines just like you did for the overall headpiece. So when I cut these apart and then sewed them back together, then you end up with a piece that is the same size as your original pattern piece that you started with. So then I have my minky headpiece that I want to attach it to. So now I would just sew these pieces together along this seam line, just like that. And then I'm going to end up with just one piece that now has a very fluffy cheek fur on it. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin these pieces together so that you can see how it lines up. So because I have stripes that I need to match here, I'm going to start by positioning those. You can just view it from the sides and make sure that your colors line up. It's pretty easy to do when you have colors that are so different from each other. And then just pin through it. Can be difficult to get pins through the thick faux fur. And just make sure that your faux fur is lying flat when you're pinning this, and that your colors are split appropriately so you don't have any faux fur from the wrong color crossing the wrong side. But if you don't have more than one color in your pattern piece, then you don't have to worry about that. And I have this difficult seam here where it's a square, so you don't have to make it difficult like that. You can just transition it nice and smoothly, but I went ahead and added that complex shape. So I'm just going to sew to this point first and then deal with the corner seam after. Okay, so I've got my seam pin now. I'm just gonna sew this line. Alright, so I've just sewn this line here, and before I go on further, just double checking that my stripes have lined up okay, and they look good. They're transitioning very nicely from where it is on the minky to the faux fur. And if you have any messiness, just check to see if it's any individual strands that have gotten caught going over your other colors, or if you actually need to redo that seam. But now I need to sew this corner seam here, which I'll show you how I do that. So on my piece here, just that first seam that I sewed, I have only sewn to this point here. So if you can see where this little point is from this square shape, I've just sewn to this corner. And now I'm going to take a pair of scissors and just cut to that corner just through the minky, not through the faux fur. So this is just going to make it a little easier to turn and pin. So now I can more easily flip this piece of minky onto the faux fur. And I'll link a text tutorial I've done for sewing these angular seams that's on my website. I don't have a video tutorial for it, but I suppose this is one right here. So now I just need to sew right to this corner right here and match up with that first seam. Alright, and I'm all done. So just that tiny little seam made that square shape that we have here. And now I have some fluffy cheeks. This is just my side head pattern piece now. I can go ahead and sew this into my head like normal. It's a little awkward here because you have this big faux fur, so you have to make sure that you treat the actual edge of the fabric backing as your pattern piece and not the edge of the fur. But other than that, you're just going to treat this like a normal headpiece and then get a nice fluffy cheek effect. So let's go ahead and do that and see how it looks all together. So here's the finished head. You can see the nice cheek fluff we've got on both sides. It's nice and thick. It's got a nice shape to it. Definitely makes the head look more interesting than we just used minky or something instead. Pretty simple to do if you're familiar with color blocking, and easy way to make your plushies look nicer. So hope you learned something today and you use this technique. I'd love to see what you make with it. And thanks for watching. Bye-bye.